their county jails. And I assist them with work in those jails. And then also West Virginia, they have regional jails instead of county jails there. So I work with them in conjunction with things that happen in those jails.
Okay. And you were also an auditor for the DOJ?
Yes, I was a Prison Rape Elimination Act auditor for the Department of Justice. I was certified to do that. And I've also worked with a company called Creative Corrections out of Beaumont, Texas, which has a contract with the United States Marshals as well as the Immigration Service. And I would go out on audits with them from time to time all over the country, and we would go into a facility and just, like my part was usually the security aspect and food service. I don't know why I got food service, but that's what they always wanted to send me. So we would go in there and do that, and then there would be a report written by Immigration as to how the facility was handling the detainees.
Okay, and over your time with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, you had additional training on top of your initial training?
Yes, I attended new lieutenant's training, captain's training, public information officer training, disciplinary hearing officer training, lots of correspondence courses. I took advantage of it.
And were you also an instructor over the years?
Yes, I instructed side handle baton tactics. Also did annual training. I taught every year, starting in 1993, I would teach ethics, contingency plan training, use of force, use of deadly force, key control, just a lot of security things that involve the prison daily operation.
Okay. And you mentioned several different types of, you mentioned camps, federal detention centers, things like that. Can you briefly explain to us the difference between a correctional institution, a camp, a detention center?
The way the Federal Bureau of Prisons operates, and it's basic like most others. They have minimum security prison camps, which have no fences. The inmates are there to serve their sentence, usually a short sentence, or they're inmates who have committed what we would call normally white-collar crimes, minor drug crimes, that sort of thing. And it's also inmates who have gone through the system. They may have started in the United States Penitentiary, but over the years worked themselves down to where they could be at a camp setting. So then the next level is a low-security facility that involves a fence and perimeter patrol vehicles, and it's an enclosed facility. And the inmates that are there are probably towards the end of their sentence, or inmates who have committed crimes that aren't that violent. And then the next level is a medium security facility, and that's where the fences get larger, the security gets bigger, more things happen. And then after that, we have a United States Penitentiary where the fences get really large and they're electrified, and we have towers, gun towers, both outside and one inside the facilities in most of the newer facilities, and lots of things happen. And then we also have an administrative maximum security prison in Lawrence, Colorado that houses roughly 350 inmates who are there for terrorism, who just can't make it in any other facilities. They're very violent people. They're housed alone. They're not housed with anyone else, and that's their daily life.
Now, you also worked in special housing units?
Yes, I worked in a special housing unit as an officer. I was a special housing unit lieutenant both in Miami, Florida, and in Estill, South Carolina. And then when I was the captain, I had the overall authority for the special housing units. And then as an associate warden of programs, I had the authority over the captain, which meant I also had the special housing unit.
Can you briefly tell us what a special housing unit is or what it's for?
Special housing unit, I guess the easiest way to explain it is it's a jail within the jail. There's two sections in the Federal Bureau of Prisons and in most other entities like state facilities and that sort of thing. They basically follow the same pattern. You have an administrative side of the facility, of the detention center. I'm sorry, it's early. You have an administrative side of the special housing unit, which houses inmates who are under investigation, who have violated policies or procedures, and they're there awaiting a disciplinary hearing. And also you have inmates who are in there for protective custody. And and sometimes you have inmates there on writ, which they've come in from another part of the country to go to trial in that location, so they would be housed there in a holdover status. The other side of the special housing, which is small, is your disciplinary segregation side. The inmates in disciplinary segregation are there because they violated an institution rule or policy, and they're sentenced to 10 days, 5 days, sometimes up to 45 days. Years ago, we used to do it to 60. Now they backed it down. But those are inmates who've done things like manufacture wine, fighting, stealing from other inmates, stealing from the food service area, being absent from work, abusing their telephone privileges. There's lots of reasons you can end up in disciplinary housing because that's a form of punishment. In other words, they're segregated from others. Their commissary is very limited. Lots of things are very limited, and it's meant to do that. In other words, you violated this policy, we're going to let you serve the sentence, and we don't want you to do it again. For some people it works, and some people it doesn't. But the administrative side, going back to that, the protective custody inmates, some of them are there for years.
And as part of, I guess, the policies and procedures, are there monthly reviews and regulations that have to be followed in the special housing unit?
Yes. One of the things that we do, and other entities and state entities do the same thing, is they have a segregation review official, and they're going to review the inmate in the federal system, they review them when they first get there within 72 hours, and then after that, on a weekly basis. They meet with the inmate, sometimes informally, sometimes formally. How's it going? How's things doing? You know, how are you doing? You ready to get out of here? You know, why are you here? Can we do anything to help you? That sort of thing. And that's done weekly. Another thing that happens as part of a review is, on a weekly basis, someone from psychology services tours that unit, the special housing unit, and checks on each inmate. Hey, how you doing? That sort of thing. And then once a month, they have a more formal meeting with the inmate to check on them and make sure, and that's all documented. Both of those things are documented every time it happens. And that way we have a running thing of why this inmate is in here. Because the goal in a special housing unit, I know when I was a special housing unit, my goal was to not have anybody in there. I didn't want anybody in my special housing unit because they needed to be out with everybody else programming and doing what they're supposed to do. Then you had some people who were just always in there, and you couldn't get them out.
And so there's, I guess, regular forms that are used in this area to create a record of these checks?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Go ahead.
And I've shown the state these exhibits as well. I'll start with Exhibit D for identification. Can you tell us what this is?
This is a Federal Bureau of Prisons Form, BP 292 is the common name for it. It's a special housing unit record.
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach?
Yes. All right, as indicated at the bench, the objections are overruled, and what's been marked for identification as defense D is admitted into evidence as the next numbered exhibit for the defense.
Number 8.
I'm sorry?
Number 8.
And then defense E is admitted into evidence as defendant's exhibit number 9, and defense F is admitted into evidence as defense exhibit number 10. Granted.
Let's start with
This is the form we were talking about a few minutes ago. This is a Federal Bureau of Prisons form, Special Housing Unit record. Each inmate has one of these, and it's generated on Sunday evenings, and it starts on Monday morning. And it's a daily tracking. As you can see on there, it checks that the inmates had their meals. Did they take a shower? Did they go out to exercise? Shows where the medical personnel comes in and checks on them daily, and they sign for that. Any comments that you would need, and then where it says OIC, that's officer in charge. The officer in charge is going to initial or sign next to each one of those to make sure, because as you can see, it says shift, morning, day, and evening. So you have an officer that works from 12 midnight to 8 a.m., and they're going to monitor that morning shift. You have an officer that works from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., what's the day shift, and then an evening officer from 4 p.m. to midnight, and they're going to monitor everything that goes on with that inmate. At the top, it's going to have the inmate's name, their registered number, the institution they're assigned to, their team or caseworker. Each inmate has a caseworker, and it comes from the unit that they're assigned to. Say an inmate's assigned to Unit 1. Even though he goes to special housing, he's still assigned to Unit 1. So his caseworker, whoever that is from Unit 1, is also going to be responsible to come and check on him at least on a weekly basis. It's going to have his regular unit, like Unit 1. It's going to have the cell that he's assigned to, why he's there, violation or reason. Is he there because he theft? Is he there for protective custody? Is he there for court? When he came in, that's never going to change. If he got there on such and such date, that will always be the same. And then the time that he was received, who authorized it. It's normally going to be a lieutenant. A lieutenant has to do an administrative form that assigns the inmate there, and it also gives the inmate a copy. In other words, we're placing you in administrative detention for such and such reason, for violation of policy, protective custody, investigation, or whatever. And the inmate's going to receive a copy of that. And then, of course, the date released and whatever. And then the other pertinent information, some inmates have diabetic issues, that sort of thing, that's going to be on there. And then separation issues. If an inmate is separated from a certain group, gang, or person, we're going to put that on there.
Okay, so this is a weekly form.
Yes.
And I'm going to look at Exhibit 10. Can you tell us about this one?
It's a 30-day review done by the psychology department, and that's entered onto these forms, and then as well as entered into a database. Each inmate, that database tracks them from the time they were received in the Federal Bureau of Prisons until the time that they're released. And that, of course, is something that's used by state agencies and other things to track the same stuff.
Okay. So this is something that would go on the record as well?
Right.
And then the final exhibit number 9.
This is the special housing review form that I talked about earlier. This is where the special housing lieutenant or the captain comes in and talks to the inmate, at least on a weekly basis, and make sure everything's going well. Is there any way to get you out of here, get you moved, do something to get you out of special housing?
Now, can you tell us about differences in privileges when someone's in special housing unit versus general population?
In general population, you have lots of opportunities for programs, religious activities, schooling, more recreation activities. You can work, you can have a job, and that sort of thing. And the things I'm telling you about are not unique to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. These are things that happen nationwide in the United States.
Objection to foundation.
I'll overrule the objection.
You can go ahead.
These things happen in most every entity in the United States. Texas does it, Pennsylvania does it. Everybody does basically the same thing with inmate management. When an inmate is placed in the special housing unit in administrative detention, they don't have all the privilege that they did have when they were out in general population. There's no opportunity to go out and work. You're not going to go attend church services on Sunday morning, those sort of things. But we do everything we can to allow them to have privileges. They can do in-cell studies for education, that sort of thing. Chaplaincy service makes routine and regular rounds around to check on them and make sure everything is going okay. They have recreation. It's limited, normally to 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, and that sort of thing. And of course, the meals are served with the exception of items like bones and that sort of thing. It's the same meal. In other words, if they're having turkey legs on the compound, you're going to get a turkey leg, but you're going to get a deboned turkey leg in the special housing unit. Once you have done something that puts you into disciplinary segregation, then like I had said earlier when we were talking, your privileges are less. Your recreation is everything, and everything is the same, but your commissary and that sort of thing is greatly reduced.
Okay. Your Honor, I've shown the state what's been marked as Defense Exhibit C. May I approach the witness?
Yes.
I'm showing you this Exhibit C. Can you, without showing the jury yet, can you just briefly tell us what this is?
This is a cell drawing.
The relevancy, Your Honor, needs to be tied up.
What's your objection?
Objection is relevancy, if I may approach to elaborate.
To her showing it to the witness?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to overrule that objection to her showing it to the witness.
And to having him discuss it, Your Honor.
I'll sustain the objection to him reading from something not in evidence.
Is this a diagram of,
Objection leading.
I'll overrule that objection.
is this a diagram of a standard cell in the special housing unit?
Objection to lack of foundation.
I'll overrule the objection.
This is a typical cell drawing, and the reason that I submitted this to your office is because of the dimensions. It just shows the limited space that an inmate has in a special housing unit. This drawing is from the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum in Florence, Colorado. And the uniqueness in this drawing is it only shows one bed. In normal prisons, regular prisons, the bed is not a concrete bed like this. It's a bunk bed like we all knew when we were kids. It's just a metal bed that is attached, secured to the wall, but the dimensions are basically the same.
Okay, so this diagram, other than the single bed instead of the double bunk, is standard across the Federal Bureau of Prisons for special housing itself?
Right, it shows a toilet, a small desk area, a bed, and a shower, and it's a little over 12 feet long and almost 7.5 feet wide.
And these are the cells that you, I guess, saw and worked near when you were working in the Federal Bureau of Prisons?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, we would move Defense Exhibit C into evidence.
The same objection, note that the relevancy of lack of foundation is not connected to this case in any way yet.
All right, I'll overrule those objections. What's been marked for identification as Defendant C's admitted evidence as Defendant's Exhibit number 11.
May I have permission to publish?
Yes.
I'm showing you Exhibit 11. And you were mentioning toilet, shower, bed, pretty self-explanatory photo.
Yes, sir. Excuse me, yes, ma'am.
But this is two cells next to each other?
Yes, it's side by side, and the reason the drawing is like this is to show basically what it is and then have the dimensions on the other side.
Okay, and you mentioned bunk beds. Would someone in the special housing unit have a cellmate?
Normally, yes,
Okay. Are there situations where they would not have a cellmate?
yes.
Can you tell us how that decision would be made?
A lot of inmates don't want a cellmate, but we double them up the best that we can because it's good for the inmate to have someone in there and to talk to and that sort of thing. But there are times, there's some people who just can't get along and they have to be by themselves. And there's also sometimes separation issues, an inmate who has offended a certain group or a certain person, and we're going to separate them, but we make sure everything's safe for everybody. So it's not uncommon, but it's not real common. In other words, that's not the optimum thing you want to do is have an inmate in there by themselves.
Okay. Now, You received records from the Federal Bureau of Prisons regarding Mr. Nelson's stay.
Yes,
You've never met Mr. Nelson personally, though.
no.
And so, can you tell us what was important in the records that you reviewed? What types of records?
In the record that I reviewed, one of the most glaring things that jumped out at me was that during Nelson's time in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, it was documented by one of the captains in a form where they were trying to move him to a new program, that out of 19 years, he had spent 95% of his time in the special housing unit. And that's kind of unique.
Okay, and that was in 2014?
Yes.
So he had spent more than 19 years in prison, but that was from 2014.
Yeah, I didn't actually receive what's called a quarters assignment that would allow me to go through and see exactly how much time he was in there, but that helped me to see, that he spent most of his time in SEG.
And from the records, were you able to tell if that time was administrative segregation or disciplinary segregation or a combination of both?
The majority was administrative under protective custody, and there was a few times where he violated, institution rules or policies, and he was placed in the disciplinary side.
And there was from the records, can you tell why Mr. Nelson was often housed administratively for his protection?
He had issues with the white gangs, particularly the dirty white boys, who are a large group in the Federal Bureau of Prison System. And of course, if you make the dirty white boys mad, you've made a lot of other white groups mad. And then in turn, he had the Muslims who were mad at him. And when you say the Muslims in a federal system, you're not normally referring to the Muslim religion. You're referring to the Muslim religion and the African American inmates as a group. So I didn't see where he made the Hispanics mad, but he had everybody else mad at him. And so therefore, his choice was to stay out on the compound and take the disciplinary that's going to come from the inmates, or to stay in the special housing unit. And some of the information that I reviewed was because he had testified at a trial in 2002. When you go out on writ like that to a trial, the inmates know that, something's up. And then there were other indications that the inmates saw him as cooperating with law enforcement. And that's a no-no. That's the number one no-no in all correctional facilities. You do not cooperate with law enforcement, you're labeled and nobody wants you.
So part of it was that he was taken out of one facility, flown to a state facility, and testified against a former cellmate in a murder trial?
Objection leading.
I'll sustain the objection.
Did you see records concerning why he was taken out on the writ that you mentioned?
Yes,
And can you,
testified in a trial.
can you tell us anything more about that?
I really didn't concern myself with the trial because based on my experience and training, once you've done that, unless it's well documented and you can prove to those guys when you get back that you didn't, as far as they're concerned, you were telling.
So in the other inmates' eyes, had more to do with just the fact that he was removed and they would assume that he testified?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen inmates before who've been ostracized from the entire inmate population simply from going to the lieutenant's office.
Okay. And throughout his time in prison, there were other incidents where he was cooperating?
Yes.
Objection leading.
Overrule the objection.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, he's, from what I understand and what I read from Scott's background is he made it known that he had cooperated with law enforcement since the age of 14. He made that statement one time. He made the statement that when he tried to go out to the compound that everybody bullied him. He stayed in the special housing unit because he was one of those inmates, and I'm trying to be nice here, he couldn't keep his mouth shut. So he kept himself in a bind. And it may have been intentional, because some of the allegations that he made were not substantiated. So sometimes he made up stories to get into the special housing unit. And that's not uncommon. I've seen that before. I've seen inmates actually write what we call a drop note, that somebody was going to assault them, write it on themselves and put it in the mailbox. And then we go and pick them up to protect them, and come to find out they wrote their own note. It happens.
So, but in the records, you saw evidence, did you see evidence of Mr. Nelson, I guess, reporting rule violations to correctional officers and things like that?
Not specific rule violations or anything, but that was, we used to call them cops in khaki. They always wanted to help. And they helped, but they put themselves in danger by doing that.
Okay. So, and Mr. Nelson was held in many different facilities all over the country?
I believe he was in 9 different federal penitentiaries.
Okay, and did they range all over the, I guess, the continental U.S.?
If you'll let me look, I can tell you exactly real quick.
Objection to referring to his notes, Your Honor.
Sustain the objection. You can ask some other questions.
Yes, Your Honor. Was that information contained in the records?
Yes,
And would it help refresh your recollection if you were able to review your notes?
yes.
Your Honor, may the witness.
Your Honor, may we approve?
Yes?
Your reference notes, do you have a portion of your notes that have this information?
Yes,
Can you find it for us so that we can review it?
sure.
You're referring to something in the records that you were given, not actual notes.
Correct.
May I approach the witness again?
Yes.
And may you refresh your recollection with the records?
Mr. Nunley, you reviewed them, correct?
No objection to that, Your Honor.
Okay, go ahead, sir.
And so I was asking which locations he had been housed in around the country.
He was in Colburn, Florida, at the United States Penitentiary there. He was in Lee County, West Virginia. He was in Lompoc, California. He was at Pollock, Louisiana, Florence, Colorado, Leavenworth, Kansas, Atlanta, Georgia, Terre Haute, Indiana, Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, as far as penitentiaries.
Okay. And are you familiar with the procedure and the forms used to, when an inmate needs to be taken out of the prison for medical procedures?
Yes.
And can you briefly tell us what that entails when you're planning to take someone out for a medical procedure?
It's initiated by the medical department, the medical records clerk. And there's 2 forms, actually. One is a medical part of it, saying who the inmate is, where they're going, what doctor, what hospital, or whatever along that lines, when the scheduled appointment is, the date and time. And it's normally generated about 20 days out to get all the authorizations. And then the second part of the form is the security aspect of the form, and it's generated by the Central Inmate Management Manager. And what they do is they take the inmate's central file and they'll look at it and make sure there's no issues why that inmate can't go to that certain facility, because sometimes there are issues why an inmate can't go to certain areas of the public. And they're going to check that. They're going to check separation issues and all that. And then it's going to go from there to the unit manager, double check what the CMC has done. And then from there, it's going to go to the captain's office, and the captain is going to do the security part of it. In other words, this inmate's security level, he's in high. If he's a high security inmate, he's going to require 3 officers, sometimes a 4th officer, which would be a lieutenant, depending on the inmate. and then the number of weapons and the number of vehicles that they're going to do. Then it's going to go from there to the associate warden. The associate warden is going to double check all of that and make sure he's okay with it. And then it goes to the warden for final approval. And then the inmate goes out on the trip. The inmate never knows. They don't know when they're going to go. We just one morning go and say, hey, come with me. You're going to the doctor for security reasons.
Okay. And when you look through the records, was there an incident in April of 2016 where Mr. Nelson was removed?
Yes.
Can you tell us what you know about that?
I just remember it's some type of medical procedure. I mean, my focus was on the special housing unit part of it, and I just saw that he had a medical trip.
Okay. And then
Nothing out of the ordinary.
was there another form where he was to be taken out again in August of 2016?
Possibly, yes.
Okay. You mentioned you looked through the incident reports,
Yes.
and you talked about, well, the incident reports, what are those?
An incident report, it's like a traffic ticket. An inmate, say he cursed at me. Well, I can write him an incident report for abusive language. I can write him an incident report for insolence, or I can combine the two. He was insolent and he cursed at me, that sort of thing. An inmate that assaults another inmate would receive an incident report. Two inmates fighting are both going to receive incident reports. That's what an incident report is. It's basically a ticket.
And was there, can you tell us what you saw in Mr. Nelson's history?
If I recall correctly, the number that I saw was of 68 over a 20-year span, or a little over a 20-year span. And the majority of those were being insolent, making threats, minor assaults. And to explain the minor assaults, a minor assault could be that an officer went to give you your food tray and you reached out and you touched their hand. Some officers are sensitive like that. The threats could be cursing at the officer, saying, I'm going to kill you and your entire family, which I've heard that 1,000,000 times. And some officers are sensitive and they'll write that up. You know, that sort of thing. He refused work programs and other programs, which was probably because he wouldn't leave the special housing unit. That's common. Because as a special housing unit lieutenant, I wrote a lot of those. It's time for you to leave. You need to go back to general population. Well, I'm not going to go. Well, I'm going to write you an incident report. All right, that conversation's over. He had a lot of those. But mostly it was insolence, threatening, that sort of thing. I don't recall any for fighting or anything violent like that, but the minor assaults were in there. But those minor assaults could be.
Objection calls for speculation.
I'll sustain the objection.
So you mentioned that it's common for certain inmates to commit minor infractions to stay in SHU.
That happens, yes.
And is there a term that you use for that to describe people like that?
But
Maybe unofficially.
cell warriors, we call them, because you got to remember that you're separated by a big metal door. And a lot of people are real mean behind that door because you can't get to them. And then sometimes the officers, they're mean because they know the inmate can't get to them. So you have that back and forth nonsense. But you have some of that. There was an instance one time I recall in reviewing Nelson where he spit on the window. Well, okay, so he spit on a window. The officer wrote that up. I mean, like I say, some officers are more sensitive than others. I didn't write a lot of incident reports because I just didn't see the need in it.
So when you use the term cell warrior, you're someone who's loud in their cell, but not necessarily once they're out, like being moved or getting the recreation time.
Yeah, there was two incidents that I recall reading. One was that overall that Nelson got along well with staff. And then the other was an instance with he and some officer, I believe in Orange County, where there was a verbal altercation back and forth, and then Nelson apologized to him. That happens. I mean, in the heat of the moment, you know, I mean, remember that drawing we showed you? I mean, somebody's in a box all day long. Sometimes they let off a little steam. Different people do it different ways. Normally inmates are pretty good about it, but some that's their way of acting out.
And you mentioned a step-down program.
Yes,
Is it the RHU?
yes.
Can you tell us about that?
The RHU is a reintegration housing unit in Oakdale, Louisiana. What that is a step-down unit, and it's actually an integration unit. In other words, we're going to send you there because you can't get along well, you don't play well with others. You know, we're going to send you there, and hopefully you can make it through this program, and once you're released, then you can start making it out in the general compound. And normally it's a 3-step program, I think it still is, where you go in with limited privileges, and that lasts for a certain period of time. And then as you progress and you do better, then we're going to increase your commissary, we're going to increase your phone calls, we're going to maybe increase your recreation. And then as you interact with other inmates better, you'll go to the next step, and then to the final step, and then hopefully you make it out of there and you do well. Nelson failed.
He was referred to that program in 2014.
Yes.
May I approach the witness with Exhibit P?
Go ahead.
And I've shown it to the state as well. I'm showing you Exhibit P. Is this part of the records that you reviewed?
Yes, it's a referral form. Normally when an inmate is referred to programs, they have lots of different programs in prison systems. And this is his referral form. It was originally dated, looks like 5/2/14 by the unit manager. That's who originates it. And it has information about the inmate, their history, and that sort of thing on there. And then it goes up the ladder to try to get them into that program, because not everybody's accepted.
Your Honor, at this time, I would move what's been marked as for identification into evidence as the next defense exhibit.
No objection.
Without objection, what's been marked for identification as defendant's P is admitted into evidence as defendant's Exhibit 12.
And you mentioned that it appeared that the rule violations were intended to, I guess, stay in segregation.
Probably some of them.
Okay, is that something that you've seen with inmates during your time?
Yes.
May I have one moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
And you mentioned that it's sometimes common to have 2 or 1 inmate in these cells that we've been talking about?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yes, the cells, the diagram is still up behind you. You mentioned that, I guess it would normally have 2, sometimes just 1.
Yes.
Is it, maybe not common, but does it happen where sometimes 3 inmates are in a single cell?
That happened from time to time back several years ago. That's something that we did. We didn't want to, but we had to.
Okay. What about certain inmates breaking fire sprinklers, flooding their toilets, things like that? Is that something that happens as well?
Yes.
Is that common?
It's not common, but it happens more times than you want it to. The sprinkler head thing is used to be pretty common.
Okay. And then if someone gets in trouble, an inmate gets in trouble, are certain different restraints other than just handcuffs used?
Well, the officer in charge has the ability to up the restraints as much as they need to make the inmate comfortable. Normally, in a special housing unit setting, inmates are all transported from one area to another, handcuffed from behind. But there's some inmates who may require what's called a Martin chain, and it's a chain that goes around their belly, and they're cuffed in the front, and they have what's called a black box on there, and it's a very heavy plastic box with a little metal shield over it, and so you should secure it like this. And then also some inmates wear leg irons, which this what it says. It's leg irons, it's a chain between your ankles.
Are 4-point restraints something that is used?
Yes.
Can you tell us what that means?
That is something that was used years ago more frequently than it is now. We've gotten away from that, but inmates who are just, if they're a danger to themselves or a danger to someone else, an inmate would be restrained 4 points. In other words, his wrist and his ankles, and he's restrained to a bed. That's where in this drawing, the concrete bed comes from. That concrete bed actually has 4 little things on the side of it to do that. That's done in very, very extreme circumstances, but it has been done. You start off using soft restraints, which are the things that you see like in the medical hospital, the wraps. We start off with that. If an inmate is too violent for those, then we'll use hard, regular handcuffs.
Okay, and I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but the 4 points being the arms and legs?
Right, both wrists and ankles.
Okay. And going back to what you said about inmates trying to stay in segregation, is it common for inmates to, I guess, hide out in certain areas or programs and serve their sentence that way?
Back years ago, when we allowed inmates to have cigarettes, there were some inmates, as long as they had cigarettes and coffee, they'd stay there forever. So, I mean, some inmates are comfortable there. Inmates serve times in different ways. There's some inmates who prefer to be in a special housing unit. There's some inmates who like staying in the chapel. Some like the law library. Some inmates play softball. I mean, every inmate has his own certain way of doing time. Some immerse themselves in work, their job. So everybody has the way that they do their time. And with Nelson, his was mostly in special housing.
And did you see times where he both asked to be removed from special housing and go to general population, and times where he asked to be put into segregation?
Yes, more saying that, no, we couldn't go out in the general population. But there were a couple of times where he would make the case that he thought he could make it.
Okay. Your Honor, I've shown the state defense exhibit B. May I approach the witness?
Yes.
I'm showing you some documents labeled B. Do you recognize these as part of the records that you looked through as well?
Yes.
And when someone, either an inmate or someone in administration, requests protective custody for a specific reason, their forms generated for why, anything regarding the reason for it?
Yeah, it's called a due process hearing for protected custody, but basically it's what we always refer to as a threat assessment. In other words, what is the inmate telling us that there is a threat, and we want to verify the threat to make sure that everything is okay. And of course, if there is a threat, make sure the inmate is separated from those that he perceives the threat from.
Your Honor, at this time we would move defense exhibit B into evidence as the next number exhibit.
No objection.
Without objection, what's been marked for identification as defendants B is admitted evidence as defendants exhibit 13.
Thank you, Your Honor. I don't have any other questions for this one.
Cross-examination?
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, sir.
You mentioned very briefly that Mr. Nelson has had some issues in the Orange County Jail since he's been housed here. Now, I believe you reviewed some Orange County Jail records. Is that correct?
Yes.
What sort of disciplinary issues has Mr. Nelson had in the Orange County Jail?
Refusing to go to court. He had an issue with one of the officers over some hair clippers, I believe it was, where he wanted to get his hair cut, and the officer said in a minute, and Nelson said no now. So that was a verbal altercation there. There was another issue, I believe, when in one of the court holding cells, he demanded more food.
Has Mr. Nelson threatened anyone in Orange County Jail?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, when he did the barbershop thing and that sort of thing, yelling and threatening.
Has he alleged that some inmates in the Orange County Jail are receiving treatment better than him?
Yes,
He's been fairly graphic in those statements, hasn't he?
yes.
And he's been using racial slurs in making those statements, hasn't he?
Objection, Your Honor.
Yes.
Now, sir, you testified that when Mr. Nelson was housed in the Bureau of Prisons, that he had offended, I believe you said he had offended everyone but the Hispanics.
It looked that way.
How did he do that? Can you tell from the records?
There was,
Objection, Your Honor.
Yes. Mr. Nolan, I'm sorry to interrupt. Members of the jury, in just a moment, we are going to take a brief recess. During the recess, you're going to continue to leave the notepads and the pins here, your pins here. During the recess, you're under all the court's instructions, including but not limited to the instruction not to discuss this case amongst yourselves or with anyone else. Please follow the deputy in the jury room. We'll bring you back as quickly as we can. Thank you. All right. I was passed a note that at least one of the jurors needed a restroom break, so we will take one as well. And sir, if you need to use the facilities, feel free to do that. We'll be in a brief recess.